Hello again. As you know, I'm Eli the Computer Guy, and this is episode 337, Introduction to Remote Desktop Software. So, as systems administrators in the modern world, remote desktop software is going to be an invaluable tool for you. It may seem inconceivable, but back when I was dealing with systems in the late 90s, we did not have good remote desktop software. We had remote desktop software. It just wasn't very good. Like literally, I remember when the corporation that I was working for, deployed this remote desktop software. It would take half an hour to do anything on a remote user's computer. It was still easier and quicker to walk them through how to fix a problem over the phone than it was to take control of their desktop systems. Basically, they deployed this really expensive, wonderful software, we were told, so that we could administer these systems remotely all over the country. And then what we found out is it was generally easier to hop on a plane, fly all the way there, and fix the darn thing physically than it was to use remote desktop software. Well, now, as I say, it's 2012, times have changed, things are a lot better now, and remote desktop software has come a long way, and it is now an invaluable tool. Now, why I'm doing a class on introduction to remote desktop software is because there are differences in all the different types of software out there, and just like any other piece of technology that you're going to deploy to the field, deploy to a production environment, there are things that you have to think about before you start using one of these pieces of software. So you have to think of things like network considerations. You have to think of things like security considerations. Again, you have to think of things like licensing and pricing. So these are the types of things that we are going to talk about today because, again, remote desktop software can be absolutely, absolutely wonderful, but as with all things, if you pick the wrong product for the wrong job, it's just not going to go very well. It's not going to do well. Now, one of the first questions that everybody brings up is, Eli, with remote desktop software, how can I bill clients for this service, right? So Eli, the Computer Guy, my whole brand really is focused around consultants, lone IT people, and a lot of people want to bill for remote administration services. So you'll sit in somewhere in Denver and remotely control a computer in Alaska, and you want to get paid good money for that. The problem is again, the problem with business is people's mentality. So whenever you're going to go bill a client, their mentality and their view about how much work you did and what that is worth will determine what they're willing to pay. And the sad fact is, what I have found is that it is generally very difficult to get money out of clients for remote services. They don't want to pay enough money. So if, like here in Baltimore, if I hop in my car, I go to a client site, I spend 10 minutes fixing a problem, I explain to them what happened, I can very easily bill them $100 for a minimum 1 hour's worth of work. Again, as I would say as a consultant, you should be doing 2 to 3 jobs per day. That is a minimum of $200 to $300 per day going into your pocket as just a normal schmo, right? The issue is once you start doing remote support, people don't see that as valuable. If you show up at their business, they feel that is worth $100. If you remotely control their computer, they feel that's worth $15, $20, maybe if they really like you, $25. And again, one of the problems you get into with business is it's as much about getting clients as it is about doing the work. So if you do 3 jobs and you can bill a minimum of $100 by going to the client site, that's $300. If you do 3 jobs and the remote desktop work, that's $75. Now $300 a day, I can pay my mortgage. $75 a day, that's barely paying the grocery bills, if you know what I'm saying. So one of the things that I will tell you with this remote support is, in general, what I say is, especially for small consulting shops, is don't do it. Don't charge for the services. When I had my consultancy, there were only 2 times I allowed either myself or my employees to do work that way. One was if we had genuinely made a mistake in the shop, somebody had forgotten to change some setting, The client took it back to their house, there was a problem, then we would use the remote desktop software to go in 5 minutes fix the problem. Why? Because that made everybody happier. We didn't have to waste a lot of time. We could only spend 5 minutes fixing the problem. The client didn't have to bring the computer back in. It was all good. The other time that we would use remote desktop software is for our exceptional clients. When we had clients, again, that would drop $10,000 or $20,000 basically for the hell of it, those were the clients we would use the remote desktop software on. The reason is because they were that valuable. When they're paying us $10,000 plus a month, you don't exactly have to bill for everything, if you know what I'm saying. You're already making enough money off of them. So those are the only two times. So if you're going to be doing remote desktop support, basically, again, I would say only use it when you're trying to get yourself out of a hole, or when you're using it for clients that have already paid you enough money to make it worthwhile, whether they're on maintenance contracts or whether they are just paying you, frankly, simply so much that you can toss them a bone every once in a while. So that's one of the big things with doing this remote support. Now, the next thing you're going to have to think about with remote support is, what are you willing to pay for, or what licenses do you need? So, as with everything, there's a lot of different software out there to do remote support. So there's VNC, there's Remote Desktop, there's Remote Web Workplace, there's LogMeIn, there's Citrix, there's Citrix Go to Assist, there's all kinds of stuff. All of these things have different licenses and have different ease of use. So one of the things that you're going to have to think about is, what are you willing to pay, and what is having the software simply work worth to you. So there is a very cool piece of software out there called Click Vnc. So VNC is one of the grandfathers of the remote desktop support software. It's been around forever. With what Click Vnc allows is, you can put a link on your website, your client can click that link, and then your computer in your office automatically connects to their computer, and it works wonderfully. So basically, it is a free, open source, blah, blah, blah version of LogMeIn Rescue or Citrix Go to Assist. The wonderful thing about it is that it's free. The not wonderful thing about it is that it doesn't always work. So back when I had the shop, I was looking at remote desktop solutions. We did try Click Vnc, and the issue is it worked perfectly 90% of the time. 90% of the time, it was awesome. Awesome. Well, the question that you have to ask yourself is, how much money is 10% failure rate worth? For me, when I had a real business, when I had real employees, I could go and I could buy LogMeIn Rescue for $130 a month, and it worked 99% of the time. So $130 a month was worth knowing that it's going to work almost all the time. That was worth good money to me. So that's going to be one of the issues, that when you're dealing with this stuff, is things like VNC is free, remote desktop is free. Those solutions and services are free, but they're not as easy to use as some of the pay-for services. LogMeIn or LogMeIn Professional, it may cost you a few bucks a year, but it's very seamless, it's very easy, and you don't run into any major issues. So that's going to be one of the big things that you should be thinking about with this remote desktop software. Again, I can't tell you what the decision. Maybe you should use VNC, maybe you should use remote desktop, maybe you should use something else. It all depends on what you decide. That is the final thing before we go over to the whiteboard, explain some stuff about this networking, is that with all this different remote desktop software, it all does stuff slightly differently. So again, when you use VNC, using VNC is not exactly like using remote desktop, which is not exactly like using LogMeIn, which is not exactly like using LogMeIn Rescue, which is not exactly like using Citrix Go to Assist, which is not exactly like using Teamviewer. So again, if you're going to be in a production environment, you should experiment with all of these different types of remote desktop software to figure out what works for you best. And then basically stick with what you like. Again, when I ran my shop, the first time we used LogMeIn Rescue, cost $130 a month, was great. Then when I ran my shop last year, tried to get back in the business, didn't work. Computer repair is dead. It's not worth it, I swear. We used Citrix Go to Assist. Basically, with Citrix Go to Assist, it was pretty much the same as LogMeIn Rescue, but it was $60 less a month. It was only like $65 a month. So that was good for me. Now, one of the things when you're thinking about remote desktop software, the question then comes up is, what are you going to be using this for? Again, whenever we talk about technology, business, we have the technology, we have the business, we have the art. So the technology is the actual remote desktop software. The business is how we get paid for it. And now what is the art? The art is how we actually use this in production environments. Why do we actually use this in production environments? The first reason, as you guys know, why you would use remote desktop software is to actually support remotely end users. So your client is off in Uzbekistan and their printer isn't working, so you can remotely connect into their computer, figure out what's going on, and fix the problem. So that's the first reason. That's what everybody thinks about. Well, the next reason, one of the reasons I like remote desktop software, is if you're going to be doing demonstrations or videos the way I do, remote desktop software is nice because you can install a whole system exactly how you like it, have it running on its own physical box, remote desktop into that system, and then do a screen capture from that. So some of the videos that I do, sometimes I use virtual computing, other times I use remote desktop or VNC to remotely control another computer to show you what's going on. What I like about this is, again, we've talked about virtual machines before, we've talked about virtualization, and we've talked about when you run virtual computers on top of the computer that you're currently using, the host computer, sometimes resource allocation can get screwed up. Sometimes just the amount of resources that virtual machine needs ends up affecting the host computer. So what's nice is if you create a computer and then remote into it, then you know that you're not going to mess up the host system because you're just opening up the system to look into it. Another reason that you want to be using this remote desktop software nowadays is also for virtualization, so that you can administer virtualized servers. So we've already had the class on Type 1 hypervisors, and with Type 1 hypervisors, basically you install the Type 1 hypervisor onto a box. Then you install instances of operating systems onto that Type 1 hypervisor. But now the question is if you have 10 or 20 or 50 instances of operating systems on one computer, how do you administer those different servers? Well, with remote desktop software, that's what you can do. So if you have an Exchange server that's been virtualized, you can reuse remote desktop, connect to the Exchange server, and then administer it. Or if you have an Active Directory server, you can use remote desktop and connect to the Active Directory server to administer it. So administration now of virtualized servers is very important. And again, this is something that really wasn't around 5 or 6 years ago. This is becoming more and more important. The final reason that you should think about using remote desktop software, and a great one for when you're trying to sell services to clients, is so that your clients can remotely work from home doing things. So I have sold this quite a bit, where my clients, they get big enough, they have real accountants, and so the real accountants need to be able to access QuickBooks to be able to do whatever accountants do with QuickBooks, right? Well, the problem is trying to remotely use QuickBooks over a VPN or any thing like that can be a real problem. It can bog down network resources. It can just be a pain in the butt. Well, for accountants and bookkeepers, so on and so forth, what I found was very useful for my clients is I would set up the accountant computer, which was a full physical computer with the accounting software on it completely configured, and then they would remote into that one computer and do all of their work. So QuickBooks is installed on the local area network within their building, and they are remoting into it to do the work that needs to be done. So sometimes the CEO needs a remote into it, sometimes the accountant needs a remote into it, sometimes the bookkeeper needs a remote into it, but now you have one physical system on their network. They simply remote control it from wherever they're at, and it works well. That is one thing I have made a lot of money off of. So when we're thinking about all of these things, one of the issues that we need to think about are networking issues. So let's go over to the whiteboard for a second. So again, whenever we're talking about modern IT world, modern technology world, we are almost always talking about networking issues. Network. So the question is if you have a computer here and you want to remotely control it, what networking issues do you have to worry about for this computer? Well, the first thing is if you're trying to connect to this computer over the internet, the first computer is going to have to go through the internet and get down to the computer that you're trying to remotely control. So generally, this is done with pieces of software such as VNC or Remote Desktop, is you have your external IP address, 67.88.44.2. This is in your router. And then you have the IP address for this computer, which is 192.168.1.10, right? So for the Remote Desktop software here, you would say point to 67.88.44.7. So that will bring it to the router for this network. Then within the router, what you're going to be doing is port forwarding. You're going to forward the ports for the Remote Desktop software to the computer, 192.168.1.10. Now again, whenever you're dealing with this Remote Desktop software, these are all different networking programs. A lot of times they use different ports, so you're going to have to see what port that particular software is using. I think VNC uses a different port than Remote Desktop Protocol. So that's one of the first things you have to think about. If you use a software where you're going to be connecting to it, you have the client here, it'll connect to the external IP address, and then that will have to point the ports to the local IP address of whatever you're connecting to. Now, one of the issues with this, as you're going to notice, whenever you do port forwarding, you can only forward a port to one computer. So again, one of the questions you come up to is, what if you have multiple computers that you want to be able to remotely access? Well, if you can only forward the port to one computer, then that's not going to work right. That's not going to work well. So one of the ways that you can do this Remote Desktop software is if you use something like LogMeIn. What happens is LogMeIn has their own server up here on the web. All the computers are regularly communicating with LogMeIn's server. So what happens with something like LogMeIn is when you're at the client computer, you connect to LogMeIn servers, which already has a connection to the particular computer you want to connect to, and then it hands it off, so you are now talking to this computer. So this is something very important to think about. If you're using VNC or Remote Desktop, you're dealing with these port issues, you can only remotely control one computer. If you use one of these types of Remote Desktop software that basically phones home, then they will connect to that main server up in the cloud. When you want to remotely control one of these computers, you connect to LogMeIn server, which will then connect you to the computer that you're trying to access. So that all works with NATing and routing and all that kind of stuff. So this is one of the things that you have to think about. One of the other things that you have to think about, one of the reasons why I like LogMeIn, is remember, if you have a router and it connects to the internet, right? And you're on a computer here. Well, if you're on a computer here, and the configuration in this computer to remotely control this computer is the external IP address. Remember, to prevent hacking, routers don't allow you to loop back in. So let's say the external IP address is, 67.88.44.2, right? And then the port is forwarded to this computer over here. So if we are on the outside world, we point to 67.88.44.2, it goes to this router, and this router points us to the server we're going to try to remotely control. And that is going to work. But if I'm sitting inside the building and I try to connect the same way, what's going to happen is that the packets are going to go out the router, they're going to try to get looped back in, and then the connection will not work at all. Why? Because you're trying to use this external IP address, and the router will not allow that traffic to loop out of your network and back in, because that's what hackers do, and that's what's bad. So when you're using a Remote Desktop software, if you're using something like, again, Remote Desktop or VNC, you would have to connect using the local IP address or the local the local IP address or the local host name. So if you're on the outside, you would use the external IP address. If you're on the inside, you would use the internal IP address, 192.168.1.2 or whatever. That's one of the reasons why I like services like LogMeIn and why it's worth a couple bucks a month just to pay for it. Because all these computers, let's say they are behind the router, how services like LogMeIn work is this computer. Let's say we want to remotely control this computer and we're sitting at this one. This computer is constantly talking to the server. We want to connect to this computer, so we go up to the same LogMeIn server that's out on the internet. Well, what that LogMeIn server will do is it will see if we're on the same network, and then it will invisibly hand over so that we're talking on the local network, so we don't have to worry about all this stuff with IP addresses. Basically, their server will figure out, is the computer we're trying to connect to local or is it remote? If it's local, we'll just talk locally, and if it's remote, it'll go through that way. So these are some of the issues that you're going to have to be dealing with this remote desktop software. Again, as I say, VNC Remote Desktop is free. It works very well, but you've got all these weird networking issues. LogMeIn costs a couple bucks, but it just works. You know what I'm saying? So let's go over. I've got a computer set up just so I can physically show you that I have a computer set up. That we're going to be remotely controlling. So this is my nice little Windows 8 computer that I'm using for all my demos. And I've been using Windows 8 lately. People say, why are you using Windows 8 if you absolutely hate Windows 8? Well, it is the new operating system. So I just want to show you, that I'm not showing you old stuff. When you remotely control this Windows 8 machine, it basically works like every other machine. So we have this Windows 8 laptop here, and I want to remotely control it. So we come back here. Basically what we're going to do is the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to use Remote Desktop to show you how that works. So I'm going to do a custom desktop here, and all you do is I'm going to do Remote Desktop. I just type Remote Desktop in a little run bar. It says Remote Desktop Connection, so I click on that. And now that we have the Remote Desktop Connection thing open, so basically all I did was I typed in Remote Desktop Connection, that showed up, and now the little Remote Desktop thing opens. So from here you can see it's asking what computer to connect to. So since it's local, the computer's name is test. I could also put in the IP address. Then it also gives you a lot of different options, and these are things that you should play with and you should think about. So you can do display, what quality of display you want, local resources, are they available or not, programs, experience, so on and so forth. Decide whatever you want, and then all you do is you hit connect. Now it's going to try to connect, it's going to say if there's any issues, certificates, and then now it connects. So what I'm going to do is I can now look at and administer this remote computer. So as you can see, this is Windows 8, and I can play with it as I like. So I can hit the little Windows button, and now we're looking at the desktop. If I hit the Windows button again, we go back to the green thing. If I hit right click, we get a tab. Oops, this isn't quite. So basically, we get all the ability to use this computer just like we are sitting down and using it normally. This is, as I said before, why you would use something like QuickBooks if you had an accountant or bookkeeper who wanted to be able to use QuickBooks in the office from their house. You can do this so that they can remotely access the computer, and it works pretty well. So this is all that Remote Desktop is. So that's really all there is to it. So again, depending on what remote desktop software you're using, there will be different options. Again, before, I like using a piece of remote desktop software called VNC because I find a lot of times it's easier to use and I have to worry about less issues than when I use remote desktop. Sometimes remote desktop is better. You are going to have to make the decision on why you're going to use what you're going to use. So the main things that I want you to think about as I wrap up this introduction to remote desktop class is, one, if you're going to be doing support for clients, I really want you to think about whether you really want to offer this as a paying service. I would say you don't, especially because you have to pay the bills. I don't know about you guys, but I've got a mortgage to pay, right? And so $300 a day will pay my mortgage. $75 a day is not going to pay my mortgage. So, that's a reality. People don't want to pay $100 for you to remotely control their system for 10 minutes, and that's just kind of the way it is. The other thing I want you really thinking about, again, is whichever desktop software you use, they all have their good points, they all have their bad points. Some are free, some are expensive, but I will tell you again, from a professional standpoint, paying $130 a month for a service that just works every time is a very, very, very good thing. Now, the final thing, again, with remote desktop software, this is networking software. It means it uses ports, and because it's on the network, you have to remember other networking considerations. Things like firewalls can screw up remote desktop. How ports, routers, NAT, all of that kind of stuff is going to become important when you start using remote desktop software, especially for administering remote computers. I can't tell you exactly what circumstances that you're going to be running into, but these are things you should think about. Again, as I say, things like Norton Firewall, can cause you all kinds of problems. So yeah. So, as you know, I'm Eli the Computer Guy. This was episode 337, Introduction to Remote Desktop Software. Depending on what you use, depending on what you need, remote desktop software is very, very good. I would say start playing with Remote Desktop Connection. That's part of any Windows package. It works off the shelf. I would say then go play with something like VNC, then go play with LogMeIn, and then go play and see what other stuff is out there. Again, remote desktop software has become so ubiquitous, so common nowadays that it is built into a lot of other types of software that you may want to deploy as a consultant. So nowadays there's network management software, there's software that what it will do is it will keep scanning the network, looking for problems, looking for issues, remotely install patches, that kind of thing. A lot of times that now has built-in remote desktop capability. Microsoft has some package now with SCCM, something like that. Again, it does a lot of other wonderful things, but one of the functions that it has is the remote desktop connection. Again, things you're going to have to think about from a professional level is issues like security. Do you want remote desktop to tie into your Active Directory services? Again, if you're dealing with clients that are only 5 or 10 users in a business, you probably don't want to worry about Active Directory for your remote desktop software. If you start dealing with a business with 100, 1,000, 10,000 users, then you are going to want your remote desktop software to tie in with Active Directory so that you can deal with permissions and security and you don't create massive holes in your network. Again, remote desktop software configured incorrectly is a hacker's dream, right? Because basically you are configuring servers to be servers and systems to be remotely controlled from somewhere else. And so if you don't do that right, basically you've just allowed hackers to be able to compromise a system and then have free reign over your entire network. So again, from a security standpoint, be very, very, very careful about something like remote desktop software. So yeah, I enjoyed taping this episode and I look forward to seeing you in your next one.